Hello, friends. Welcome to Lead to Gold. I am so happy to be coming back on here to talk to you all today. It feels like it's been a minute. It has been a minute, and I am just really excited to get into today's topic because it's been something that I have seen quite a lot of on social media, especially in the circles that I'm in with wellness and growth and mental health and everything surrounding that, which, by the way, if you're new here, welcome to Lead to Gold. This is a podcast that is absolutely 100% devoted to talking about all things growth, wellness, mental health, and everything I just mentioned. Yeah. So if this is your jam, I'm just really welcoming you in, and I hope that you stick around. I hope you enjoy it. And even if it's not your jam, I hope you maybe take something away anyway. Just happy that you're here, happy that you're trying it out. And I don't really have a whole lot to update you all on as far as my life, but I am happy to say that we have just entered a new astrological season. So happy Gemini season, happy almost summer. We're not quite there, but it's definitely feeling like it. And a new lunar phase. So all of these things feel very fresh, very new to me. If you maybe aren't such an astrological person, I hope that you are at least feeling a sense of newness in your life right now, or refreshment rather. Maybe if a lot of things aren't new for you, you are maybe perhaps stepping into something that feels good, feels refreshing, feels like a new direction, because I certainly am feeling that, and I hope that you are too. Oh, and retrograde. We just got out of a retrograde. Thank freaking God. This one took me for a spin. That's completely under exaggerating, but I digress. Okay, today's topic is absolutely a hot button issue. And like I just mentioned, I'm seeing it all over the place. I wanted to take some time to talk about it from my point of view and just like the things that I am noticing and sort of gaining a perspective on, not even really from an outside perspective, but rather just, somebody who tends to absorb a lot of information and then overwhelm myself and second guess my own things that have happened in my life. And I just want to piece them together and do that with some people. So that's our conversation today. And today we're exploring the question of trauma, whether we all experience trauma or whether trauma is sort of something that is particular, if it has been gate kept, if that's a word. Lots of things surrounding the idea and the topic of trauma. I hesitate to say that it is becoming a trend to say that you are traumatized or that everyone is traumatized, but I will 1000% say that it is absolutely a buzzword in this time period, and it has been for several years now. If you are a young person on the internet and you have not seen any TikToks, any Instagram infographics about trauma, I frankly do not know where you have been. And what I want to do with today's topic and today's episode is not necessarily define trauma universally, but rather explore the ways that it's talked about and kind of answer this question as best as we can: is what does it truly mean to have experienced trauma, to work through it, and who gets to say that they are traumatized? The first thing that I want to start off with before I get into this any deeper is that, of course, if this is a really big pressing issue for you, I would take this episode with a little bit of caution. I'm not getting into anything super heavy, any specific details today, but, trauma in general can mean a lot of things for different people. So if this is not really something that you want to listen to today, I am so okay with that. I hope you are well, and I hope to see you in 2 weeks when we have a new episode. But if you are here for the conversation, stick around. Again, it's really, I'm not getting into anything specific, so I don't want to freak anybody out by saying that. But we will be defining it and all of those things. So, in any case, trauma. It is something that I think many people have different opinions about, and it can have very different connotations for different people as well. For this episode, to keep it kind of simple, I have sort of categorized what I want to talk about in about 3 categories of people that have an opinion about trauma and what it means to have experienced trauma. The first category that I see, and this is mainly on social media, or in all honesty, some of the older people in my life, that they hold the belief that everybody is nowadays traumatized, but also looping in the idea of nowadays everyone is offended by everything. This view on trauma has a pretty negative connotation, meaning like, oh, everybody just claims nowadays that they're triggered and that they're traumatized and that everybody and everything offends them. And it's not a good thing. Like, to these people, it is not a good look to openly talk about your trauma or to even really like seek therapy, seek help, be open. And I don't mean to slander anybody by any means, but I will say that is definitely something that I've noticed in my life that tends to come from a sort of outdated perspective. These are people that did not grow up with the accessibility that we now have, nor the open conversations that we are trying to facilitate in sort of today's modern world. A lot of these people did not have access to therapy, nor did they feel that it was something that was like okay to do. If you were seeking therapy, it was likely that you really had some serious mental problems and that therapy was probably against your will or against your desire. So a lot of things have changed since that generation of people was growing up, the ones that I'm thinking of. But in any case, there is still this belief that if you openly talk about your trauma, if you say that you are traumatized, if you have strong boundaries and use them, that this is not a very good character trait and in fact is rather perhaps annoying or looked down upon. So that's one that I've seen. The second category that I've seen is the exact opposite, which is that everybody has experienced some amount of trauma in their life and that this is welcomed to talk about. This is something that we should be talking about and should be opening our perspectives on. And I will also say, I think this category is kind of the one that I tend to associate with people who say that trauma is subjective. So you could be the most privileged, wealthy, happy person on the planet, and you still have experienced some sort of trauma. It may not be as severe as other people's trauma. You weren't abused, you weren't bullied or neglected as a child, but maybe you have seen something unpleasant. And this sort of line of thinking could say that even that unpleasant thing that you've seen is trauma to some degree. So that's sort of the complete opposite. And then the last one is that just plain and simply not everybody is big T traumatized. There is a definition that I would like to, just go ahead and express, because without the actual textbook definition of trauma, I don't know that we can really fully get into that conversation. So according to Google, trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience or an emotional shock following a stressful event or physical injury, which may lead to long-term neurosis. If you ask me, both of those definitions are very, very different. I would say if we go by the first one, a deeply distressing or disturbing experience, then we could definitely say that everyone on this planet, no matter how privileged or lucky or happy you are, has been traumatized. I don't think you can ever live a life without a deeply distressing or disturbing experience happen to you. But if you go with the second definition, this may be something that is a little less common. So you could potentially have long-term neurosis. You have an actual emotional shock, something that absolutely stops you in your tracks. To me, these could definitely be interpreted differently. So that makes this conversation a little bit more nuanced, perhaps. But regardless, we will kind of peel back the layers. So part of the reason why I'm talking about this today is because I don't know if I've talked about it on a previous episode, but I just a couple of weeks ago finished the book The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, which I had been seeing on social media for probably several years now. It was published in 2014, so it's been around almost 10 years, but I feel as if it has become increasingly popular probably since around 2020 during the pandemic, when people had some extra reading time and were maybe looking inward and trying to figure out what they can do to better themselves. And I will tell you straight up, this is probably one of the best books to do that. If you are okay with reading into some pretty lengthy medical descriptions and psychological descriptions of things, it's a wonderful read if you can get through that sort of medical lingo. And I learned a ton just by being able to actually reflect on my past and sort of realize that my past and my childhood were definitely privileged and definitely better than I may have thought they were before I read this book. Before I get into all of my, personal experiences and findings with this, I do want to cover a couple of the basic things that The Body Keeps the Score hones in on, because as far as I can understand, I am not by any means a psychologist, but this book really kind of changed the game in how people look at psychological disorders, mental health, mental illness, and especially PTSD. One thing that really interested me about this book is that it pretty fervently and pretty obviously goes against the DSM, which is all that I had ever known about diagnosing mental illness. And it is very literally the playbook for doing so. We still use it very commonly. A lot of medical professionals use it to diagnose their patients with certain mental illnesses or mental disorders. And van der Kolk goes against this sort of action, or at the very least says that there are other things that we need to consider. It's not just a matter of ticking off a few symptoms and calling something PTSD when it may not be. There's a whole lot of detail in the book about that I won't get into because I'm frankly not going to be able to explain it very well. But if you're interested, I have the information to buy the book in the show notes. Regardless, let's get into some of the basics about this book. I think its ultimate mission is to sort of describe for people, everyday people, what trauma is and what it does to our bodies and our actions. Now, a big distinction, I think, when reading this book is that van der Kolk is talking about what I would call big T trauma. Big T trauma is when you have experienced significant abuse, neglect of any kind as a child specifically. He does mention a lot of instances where trauma happens in adulthood, but a really big focus in the book is how childhood trauma can affect our ability to form healthy relationships and really just function in our adult lives. And for many, many reasons, we can't quite pinpoint why we act a certain way when we have experienced significant trauma as children. He talks in the beginning of the book about PTSD, particularly PTSD in soldiers returning from war. And obviously this is an adult case of trauma. They experienced these horrific things when they were adults, but it is equally hard for many of them to recover from. Genuinely, his message is to say that we can experience very physical symptoms and act in negative ways towards the people in our life or just towards ourselves in very harmful ways without knowing why we're doing that, without knowing what caused us to act a certain way or what is causing this pain in our body, what are causing these alarm bells to go off. And in some cases, for us to completely black out mentally and not even know what we did or what we said or why we acted a certain way. We just have no memory whatsoever. It depends on how severe the trauma is, how much or how little a person has worked through trying to overcome them. But there are an endless amount of ways in which trauma can affect our bodies and our actions. So one of the major things that he talks about with this is, I think I actually have used this quote in a podcast before, but it is just so good and so relevant to this conversation. I'm going to use it again. He says that people are often surprised by the physical symptoms that they can experience, and even scientists are very perplexed by how this can bring about different symptoms and health issues. Somatic symptoms, he says, for which no clear physical basis can be found, are ubiquitous in traumatized children and adults. They can include chronic back pain, neck pain, fibromyalgia, migraines, digestive problems, spastic colon or irritable bowel syndrome, chronic fatigue, and some forms of asthma. Traumatized children have 50 times the rate of asthma as their non-traumatized peers. Studies have shown that many children and adults with fatal asthma attacks were not aware of having breathing problems before the attacks. So some of that is pretty crazy. And another thing that he gets into in this same chapter, just after that conversation, is something called alexithymia. I think I'm pronouncing that right, which means that these people who are deeply traumatized have no words to describe how they feel. In fact, many of them don't even recognize what they are feeling. And these are all signs of really intense trauma that has not been worked through. So in any case, that takes me all the way back to what I had said a second ago about big T trauma. These are all things that he discusses in the book. He is not talking about what I would call little T trauma, which would be something like what I said before, witnessing something disturbing, but sort of being able to overcome it on your own. That's what I would think of as little T trauma. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Another ultimate message of The Body Keeps the Score is that we have to be able to retrain our bodies in order to overcome this trauma, whatever it is, whether it's intense or not. He says the body needs to learn that the danger has passed and to live in the reality of the present. Regardless of how deep the trauma goes, how long ago it happened, however it is affecting our bodies, we need to be able to have our bodies understand that there is no current danger. And that is ultimately the thing that keeps people stuck in their trauma, is that they haven't yet learned, I'm safe right now. I'm okay right now. Nothing is out to get me. Nothing is going to hurt me. In this moment, I am safe. And really being able to metabolize that affirmation and understand that it is true. Without being able to do that, we can't overcome the trauma. So this brings me to some slightly more esoteric things. And I will say, I also really admire in this book how well Bessel van der Kolk is able to bridge the world of science and the world of medicine into the world of spirituality. Though it's not talked about as often, it is something that he brings up. And I think a lot of ideas that were previously ignored or maybe even laughed at, he was able to bring to the table in this book and bring some validity to them. And I absolutely admire that about this. He mentions the dark night of the soul later on in the book and talks about the fact that doing this work genuinely, in other words, overcoming our trauma, overcoming our pain from our pasts, is really, really hard. And this is where he calls it the dark night of the soul. If you're unfamiliar with what that is, it's essentially when you are experiencing a very, very low point in life. I've talked before about having our seasons, and I think of winter as our season of sort of stagnation, of really needing to retreat and stay quiet and maybe not be as social. this could also translate to times where we just mentally aren't doing very well and need to take that time for ourselves to recover so we can come back out again. I would describe the dark night of the soul as the kind of winter season where you are living in Greenland and the sun hasn't come out for 2 months and the snow and the blizzards have piled up so high that you can't even see out your windows because there's just so much snow, and you're going to be there for a while. That's how I would describe a dark night of the soul, which sounds really intense, but that's immediately what I think of. It's just darkness, it's pain, it's suffering, frankly. But this is the kind of experience that many people have to go through in order to come out on top of their trauma. And he does an excellent job describing this in that seeing his clients work through some of their worst triggers and their worst pain, reliving the most horrific memories, and even in some cases, like recognizing and remembering those things for the first time because they were so deep rooted and so horrible that they actually repressed them and couldn't remember them. So being able to recall that stuff and work through it, that's painful. That is really, really difficult. And not everybody makes it through that journey. That's your dark night of the soul. There's lots of different ways to think about that. But in any case, not all of us have experienced a dark night of the soul. And what I'm about to say in no way is meant to gatekeep trauma or having experienced any sort of trauma, but there are things that are difficult enough to lead to this sensation and this really, really painful period. One of those things that is talked about in the book is the ACE study, which is otherwise known as adverse childhood experiences. So I think, I'm going to forget, I'm not looking directly at the book. I think it was at some point in the 80s, a researcher and medical scientist had put together a couple of strange similarities between his clients. Some, I'm trying to also remember exactly what it was, but it was something about clients of his who had a lot of problems with their relationships to food. And if I'm remembering correctly, it was one of them had lost a lot of weight, and she was sort of going through this program that was trying to help her lose weight. And she was doing great as long as she was going through the program. She was keeping the pounds off. She was looking a lot better and potentially even like seeming a lot better. But as soon as the program stopped and then they followed up with her months later, she had gained all the weight back and then some. And they just couldn't figure out why. So I think that is essentially where the ACE study originated from. But he realized after talking to her and after talking to several other clients going through the same sort of program is that many of them were sexually abused as children, or in other ways abused as children, or in other ways had exceedingly rough childhood experiences. And he was like, okay, so there's a correlation here. This has nothing to do with their willpower or their habits. It's purely they're trying to cope with something. So he created the ACE study, and I believe it was something close to 17,000 people out of maybe 25,000 or so had agreed to take this study, and the results that they found were absolutely astonishing. So if you're completely unfamiliar with the ACE study, it is a super simple, super fast quiz that you can take, and you can find this online right now if you're interested. But it's a series of questions that ask you about your childhood. For example, did an adult in your household routinely hit, shove, or throw something at you? So that's just an example of one of the questions. And there is no, as far as I understand, there is no number that you have to hit in order for the quiz to be like, well, you're traumatized, but it does go on a scale. So they found that most of the people who took the study had at least a score of 1, but a third of those 17,000 people had a score of 6 or higher, which means, oh shit, these people are big T traumatized. 100%. And that's really alarming. That's really, really alarming. This gets us into a lot of things that qualify as big T trauma, that qualify as really difficult things to move through. And the last thing that I do want to bring up on this is just the ramifications, really, of what that sheer number of traumatized people can do and has been doing for our larger society. They did a lot of follow-up studies after coming to terms with these findings of the ACE study. And this person, his name is Robert Anda, the guy that created the ACE study and the guy who continued to study its effects and just general childhood trauma and abuse statistics afterward. He was deeply, clearly emotional after finding these things out and realizing what a huge, huge problem childhood trauma and child abuse is in the United States. This is from page 150 of the book. He had calculated that its overall costs, its being child abuse, exceeded those of cancer or heart disease, and that eradicating child abuse in America would reduce the overall rate of depression by more than half, alcoholism by 2/3, and suicide, IV drug use, and domestic violence by 3/4. It would also have a dramatic effect on workplace performance and vastly decrease the need for incarceration. I just want to sit on that for a second because that's a really, really, really big deal. And people aren't talking about this. We worry so much about heart disease and about suicide and about alcoholism and depression and drug use, all of the things that were just mentioned. We put so much emphasis on these things as the epidemics that are happening in this country. But when you look at it, when you look at the origins of why those things happen, it's child abuse. It's big T trauma. So I am in no way suggesting that every person needs to come forth and say what has happened to them. But by God, we need to be having some conversations about how big a deal this is and how many people it affects. How many people it could affect positively if we were more open about trauma and childhood abuse, and also looking into the people who are parenting and causing this big T trauma. It's a lot to take in. It's going to take a very, very long time, but we need to be having those conversations. All right. Woo. Okay. So that was a lot. Take a breath. But what I want to talk about now is kind of just like the differences between that and little T trauma, as I call it. Again, I do not want to gatekeep the experiences of trauma. I want to take us back actually for a second to that first definition that you would look up and see on Google, which is having experienced something deeply disturbing or distressing. Again, if that's the definition that we go with, probably everybody in this world has experienced trauma to some degree. This is something that I also want to say. I like the term, or I like the phrase that trauma is subjective, and I do believe there's some truth to that. If you are somebody who has lived a really privileged, really wonderful life, you had a great childhood, you would score a 0, maybe a 1 on the ACE score or on the ACE study, then you have probably not experienced any big T trauma. But that doesn't mean that things haven't happened to you that have affected the way that you act and the way that you move around in this world. That is absolutely something that is still possible and valid, something that you may need to work through. Just to give a few examples, one thing that I've realized traumatized me a little bit in the past year, and I don't even really know that I've talked to many of my loved ones about this, but when I was on vacation in Europe about a year ago, I was taking my partner to my favorite hike that I've ever been on. If you live in the UK, you might know it. It's Malum Cove, I believe. They filmed Harry Potter there. They filmed The Witcher there. It is so freaking cool. And when we were traveling through Yorkshire, I was like, okay, well, we have to go there because it's just the coolest hike in the world. I love it. So we got there. It was a gorgeous day. It was really sunny, really like perfect weather, honestly. And it's a giant cliff. When you walk up to it, it's a huge rock face that's almost disorienting how tall it is. But you can walk up the top, like it's a big hill, and you can walk up to the top of the cliff. So we're up there. When you get up to the top of it, it's very rocky, but it's also flat. I kind of picture those like Shutterstock photos of a dry, cracked desert. It looks a lot like that with the big divots in the land, except it's rocks instead of caked dirt, if you will. Anyway, a lot of the surface looks like that. There's just other little rocks weaving in and out throughout it. And I was just walking along one of them. There was a little drop below me. And I didn't trip. I don't know what happened. I still to this day have no idea why this happened. But I just fell right off the side of this small cliff, not the big one. I would have 1000% died if I did that. But anyway, as I'm falling, I had this quick moment of, I might die. This might be enough to kill me. And it was about like a 5 or 6 foot drop, but directly to the side where I was falling was just another rock. So if I fell the wrong way, I would have died 100%. Anyway, I had that moment. I fell. I immediately sprung up when I realized that I was conscious and indeed not dead. And I was like, okay, all right, we're alive. I'm good. I'm okay. And at this point, my partner had seen me and was started to run over. And I was like, I'm okay. But I looked down and I just have blood absolutely pouring out of both of my legs. So without getting too graphic, because it was graphic, I ended up having to get, I think, 10 stitches in both legs. And I was very lucky. It really, truly was not a terrible injury, although I do have some pretty gnarly scars on my legs now. But that experience, I realized throughout the months after it happened, I was just very hyper aware of how easily I could die, which sounds really morbid, but it's very true. Like any other time that I was on a hike, if we were on a steep hill or if there was like a slippery surface or something, I would immediately be like, if I slipped, I could die. Or just, there's so many situations that I've experienced since that time that I'm like, man, like if I just made one little mistake, or if somebody just made one little mistake here, that would be it. They would just die. So to me, that's a little bit of a trauma response, just being really hyper aware of that fact. And it's definitely not pleasant. I wouldn't say that it sends me into a full blown panic, but that is little T trauma for you. Another example, and this is a completely different one. This would be more of an emotional trauma response. I had an absolute mindfuck moment earlier this week when I was listening to a podcast, a pretty old one from Zura Health. If you are familiar, they're great. I'll put that one in the show notes for you. But anyway, I was listening to this podcast episode about breaking familial cycles and undoing the things that we have learned, unlearning negative behaviors and trying to get over self-sabotage. Now that I'm thinking about it, this might have been 2 episodes kind of combined. But I was driving. I was taking a really long drive and I just had to talk about this. I wished that I had all of my recording equipment with me so I could just start an episode about this. But I got a little app on my phone for voice recording and I just had a moment where I had to talk through this. And something that I realized, and something that I have been realizing, is that my parents and most of the adults in my immediate family are really not very good communicators. I love them. I know they love each other in their own way, but a lot of the things that they say to each other are so not okay. And the ways that they resolve their conflict are so not okay and not healthy. And I've been experiencing that my entire life. It's only recently and in the past couple of years that I haven't lived at home that I am understanding how deeply that affected me and my ability to communicate with the people in my life now. A quick side note, I was hanging out with my mom on Mother's Day, and she was telling me just some honestly crappy things that my dad had said to her. And my immediate reaction now is, Mom, you shouldn't let him say those things to you. He shouldn't talk to you like that. Whereas before, it was just normal. And there's other women in my life who completely succumb to their husbands or the men in their life, and they take what they say, even if it's insulting, even if it's hurtful, even if they try to defend themselves, it doesn't work. They take it and they make excuses for it. Ultimately is what happens, is they make excuses for the crappy behavior. Anyway, as I'm thinking about this, as I'm reliving all of this, I came to the conclusion that I am overcompensating for that behavior for the women in my life. A conversation between my partner and I recently has been that there are times when I am really, really snarky and really critical of him and the things that he does. And I can tell without him having to say that weighs on him, and that I, in doing that, make him feel like he's not good enough for me, or that he's doing something wrong just by being in the room. And that has been a really, really strong pain point for me recently. And as I'm listening to this podcast about ending cycles and working through unhealthy habits, I had a moment where I'm like, oh shit, I am fully 100% overcompensating for all of the women in my life who couldn't stand up for themselves or wouldn't stand up for themselves or would make excuses. Instead, the second that something goes wrong, or the second that something is not the way that I want it to be or the way that I envisioned it to be, I get upset and I retaliate. I can get very quickly agitated in that way. And it's one of those things where as soon as the conversation is over, or as soon as the thing leaves my mouth, I'm like, why did I just do that? Why did I have that reaction? I love my partner. He's amazing. He does everything he could possibly do for me and more. He is the most gentle person I've ever met in my entire life. Why am I reacting in this way? He doesn't deserve that. So we had that conversation the other day, and I was nervous to talk to him about it, but it ended up going really, really well. Just being able to admit that, like, hey, I think that this is where this is coming from. Anyway, that's little T trauma. And that is an example of me trying to work through that little T trauma. Is like, oh, okay, well, I've grown up my whole life seeing communication happen in this way. And I just now realized at the age of 26 that I've been retaliating and pushing that away, and just so fearful of anybody treating me that way that I'm not even allowing anybody to, because I'm so reactive. And that's an example of action resulting from trauma, which is pretty crazy to realize. All in all, where do we draw the line at what we can call trauma and what we can't? Because there are certain things I think that we do need to put a definition on and call it what it is. Now, something that I would love to see is people getting a little bit more clear about the types of things that they have experienced. And that doesn't mean that you have to like unveil your entire childhood experience, especially if it is one that was not so pleasant. People don't just necessarily need to know that, but maybe just for ourselves, it would be healthy and helpful to acknowledge, am I big T traumatized or am I little T traumatized? And what do I do about that? How am I how am I able to show up in my own life because of these things? What do I need to work through, and how long is that work going to take? How grueling is that work going to be? It really varies. It's another thing is that it's the things that happen to us when we are younger that we don't necessarily remember that can really end up being troubling. And that might not even be big T trauma. That could be really anything. It's the things that we don't remember or that we can't quite pinpoint why we are doing something in our present life that can really make things tricky. Because if you don't know what's causing it, how can you overcome it? So this is pretty interesting. And this is also a part of The Body Keeps the Score that I love. I am still a little bit skeptical of it. I'm not going to lie. But I very, very much trust this author and all of the work that he's done. I'm almost curious to try some of the solutions that he offers towards the end of the book. EMDR is one of those things. And I am not super familiar with it even after reading the book, even though he describes it very well. But it's a sort of almost like hypnosis tactic that gets people to recall some of the things that happened to them in their early childhood that they have never been able to remember before. And having that memory and then working through that memory is vastly helpful. I just think it's so interesting that that can even happen. It's wild to me to think about the fact that I might have repressed memories, or that anybody has repressed memories. I just think it's crazy. But in any case, very cool in a way. Another thing that we could get into here that he does touch on briefly is the concept of epigenetics. Epigenetics gets very scientific very quickly and definitely goes above my level of explanation, but there are a few simple things that we can talk about here to understand it better. One way to look at it is that it is the study of how behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. That's about the simplest definition that I could find, and that's from the CDC. Another way to think of it is, rather in biology, it's the study of stable changes in cell function that don't involve alterations in the DNA sequence. So that is not the direction I'm going to go in with this description because I barely understand it. But some theories about epigenetics is that if our environment can play a role in our physical health and our mental health especially, how far does that go? So epigenetics can change as you age. That's something that I find very interesting about this concept, is that the genes that you were born with is not necessarily what you have today, because things have happened to you and you have reacted to certain things, and that changes the way that you act and the way that you perceive the world. One theory that is presented in The Body Keeps the Score that I think is still questioned, although I would love to have people continue to look into this, is that epigenetics, because they change your cell structure, that then goes into changing the cell structure of your future children. So let's say, for example, and I'm keeping this very, very basic, that your grandmother was big T traumatized. Maybe she was abused as a child. So she had your mother. And then your mother kept some of that genetic code. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but nonetheless, she kept that same mark of having been abused, at least a little bit, right? She would then have to work through that, or would have to sort of cope with those same feelings of having been abused. Then your mother has you. And that leaves us with just a teeny tiny bit of the same genetic structure. That is essentially how I understand epigenetics to work. I think the thing that is still needing to be studied is, first off, how true that is, and if it can really, if things like abuse and big T trauma can really rub off on our offspring. But also, just if that is the case, if there is any truth to that, how severe can it be? How much of a lasting effect and how much of a multi-generational effect can it have? This calls into question a few other things. It's like, are epigenetics to blame for the way that we are? You know, maybe I wasn't ever big T traumatized in my life, but was my mother, and is that my responsibility? Can we truly, truly break those cycles? Is there anything that I can do in this waking life to maybe potentially change my own genetics and then not have that rub off on my offspring if I choose to have them? These are all, I think, such interesting questions. And I really, like I said, I really do hope that they continue to be studied and maybe we can find some correlations there. I'm endlessly fascinated by this topic and I would love to talk about it with you as per usual. All right, the last thing that I want to touch on with this topic, and this may be perceived in different ways by different people, and that's fine. But something that I do want to touch on is going back to the initial ideas of what trauma is and what it means for different people, is bringing a self-awareness aspect to it. A lot of people do not know that they are traumatized and they do not know why they act in ways that they act. That said, if it ever comes up that somebody has been hurt by your actions, or that you acted in a way that maybe you didn't mean to, or maybe it came off differently to you than it did to the other person or other people, there has to be a level of self-responsibility there. And this is not to discredit anybody who has experienced severe trauma, any level of trauma, and is unaware of it. It's a really, really nuanced subject and area. But the bottom line that I want to leave with on this idea is that if you are behaving in a way that is causing other people harm, rather than blaming it on the fact that you were traumatized or that something happened to you and this is just how I am because of that, remember that no matter what it is, whether it is trauma, whether it is a mental illness, it doesn't matter. Any and all of these things are a reason for the behavior, but they are not an excuse. There is a lot of pain done by people without really any self-reflection. And again, it's never entirely our fault, but it is our responsibility. With that in mind, I want to think about the different ideas of trauma and having experienced it in childhood, in adulthood, in any part of our lives. If we are aware of it, we do have a responsibility to overcome it and be tender with the people in our lives. And I am learning this as this week I had that conversation with my partner about my sometimes shitty communication habits and my sometimes very critical, very agitated expression of my thoughts. And that is something that I have known for a while that I need to work through, but I didn't know how until I pieced together why it is that I act that way. This is the work that we have to do. And sometimes doing this work is not pleasant. It is really never comfortable or pleasurable to look at yourself with a critical lens and go, okay, this is why you're being shitty. Or, in this moment in time, I don't know why I'm being shitty, but I need to find it out. It is my responsibility to figure it out so that I don't continue that cycle, right? And it's hard. It's not fun. It sucks. For some of us, it may lead us into that dark night of the soul for a little while. And you know what? I think we might be better off for it. No matter how painful it is, no matter how long it takes, if we want to truly better ourselves, we need to look at our own patterns. We need to get the help that we can get, that we are able and that is accessible to us to get in order to really work through these things and end those cycles, you know? Lots of things to think about with this topic. And to really just finalize on that question, is everyone traumatized? Does everybody experience some sort of trauma? My short answer would be yes. I like to adhere to the idea that trauma is subjective. However, we do need to recognize the differences between big T and little t. And I feel like those are terms that I've made up. Maybe they're not, but that is something to consider so that we can be respectful of those who have really, really, really gone through the ringer. but also just to keep ourselves in check. There are certain levels of things that are within our control, and no matter what has happened to us, we can overcome. All right. And with that little nugget of wisdom in tow for us, I think it is time to wrap up this episode. I have gone on for quite some time. And as per usual, we're going to end up with a little game of We're Not Really Strangers. As per usual, if you are listening along and you would like to journal along to this question, we're going to discuss it right here. And I would just absolutely love to hear your responses. If this is a question that has helped you see anything going on in your life for what it is, or made you think in a new way, let's talk about it. I would absolutely love to know. All right. Pulling the card now. Ooh. We always get the most appropriate questions for each episode, and I just love it. Okay. What have you been avoiding that deserves your attention? Why have you been avoiding it? I have definitely been avoiding some big girl responsibilities in life lately. And the first thing that came to mind for me was a lot of friends that have reached out, including even my brother who just had a birthday. And I have been told by several people now that I am not the best at responding to texts or messages, even if they are very well-intentioned and beautiful. And most of them are. But I, for some reason, have just been really lazy with getting back to people. And that kind of goes against everything I stand for. I love my friends. I want to stay in touch. I want to be in touch as much as I possibly can be. But for some reason, that has not been a very well-maintained area of life. Another thing on that note is just, the responsibilities of finishing up work. I, if you don't know, am a school teacher, and we are getting out in about 3 weeks, but the end of the year always brings a lot of stress and a lot of things to do, and I have just been so over it. Like, I don't want to grade. I don't want to do anything. I just want to veg out and clean the house and like do the things that I want to do. I'm very much in a me-centered point of life right now, and that definitely doesn't sound good, and it also doesn't feel very good. So I think that is something I need to get back into, and I need to stop avoiding reaching back out to people and, doing the things that will make other people's lives better. It's not all about me, It's not all about me. But what about you? I would love to know, what have you been avoiding and why? If you have an answer, DM me about it. Let's talk about it. If you have any thoughts about this episode in general, I would absolutely love to have a conversation. I always love continuing the conversations, and my Instagram DMs are open. My email is open. I don't get a lot of emails. I would love to get more. It's hello.ledtogold@gmail.com. My Instagram is led.to.gold, and I would love to see you over there. All of the links are in the show notes. So if you are curious, I have them there. I have a couple links from just today's conversation up as well. So if you want to do some further reading or further researching, it's all there for you. Thank you so much for tuning in. And I will see you guys in 2 more weeks with episode 13. I don't know what it's going to be about yet, but that's the element of surprise for you. So hope to see you there. Hope to see you on my Insta, and I just hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Thanks for chatting with me, and I love you so much. Bye.